Since we're sitting at the table and presenting, we're not getting this part of the podium.
Yeah, what I noticed today, though there's not as many people, probably feel Are we ready? Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm cognizant of time, recognizing that everyone's coming from lunch as well. And but I don't want to run into coffee break in the transition to our next session. So we'll welcome everyone as they come in and welcome you as well. Tansy, bonjour. Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Anne-Lisa Jensen, and I'm the moderator for today's panel, Financing Indigenous-led Conservation. I'm the Indigenous Conservation and Engagement Director for NCC, Nature Conservancy of Canada, for the Alberta region. And I'm really excited to be here today and welcome these amazing panelists and session participants that we have here. This session is being broadcast. Excuse me. And there are also headsets in the back. I guess nobody will be speaking French, so we don't need the headset portion. But just so you know that if you are taking the mic later, that everybody can speak loud and clear. Our session participants have decided to speak off the mic. Sitting down, I noticed today when we stand, we kind of block the presentation screen as well. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge our session today is taking place on Huron-Wendat territory, and that this is an important meeting place and crossing for many Indigenous nations. So today we have an exciting opportunity to sit intentionally in a space of innovation in Indigenous conservation finance, one that is driven by sovereignty, self-determination, governance, and natural laws, and how we can work to decolonize current funding models to accelerate financing and support for Indigenous-led conservation and nature-based climate solutions. I'd like to acknowledge as well in the room TD Bank, who is demonstrating for the Nature Conservancy of Canada with the recently announced substantial support, how as well corporate and support from very important partners can really leverage this work for us. And I express our appreciation. What we would like to do is have each session participant introduce themselves. I did have bios prepared, but in our way, we would prefer to do individual introductions. However, I will express with honor to welcome Chief Anne Richardson, the chief of the Rappahannock tribe, who is here today, as well as Brian Van Stippen. I'm just going to keep my notes because I had bios written, so I want to make sure I'm getting everybody's titles correct here. He is the program director for the National Indian Carbon Coalition. Rain Playfair is the director of stewardship funding for Coast Funds. And Kim Neal is the vice president for Resilient Habitats for World Wildlife Fund. So what we will do is progress through some great slide presentations from each of our participants here. And then I will ask some questions and then hopefully have some time. We'll ensure we have time maybe cut back on my part for questions from you all. So I'd really like to welcome Chief Anne, who you may have heard from earlier today. We'll be hearing much more about her tonight as a Visionary Award recipient, and I'm very honored to welcome you and welcome you to your microphone, which is hopefully working.
Testing. All right. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here and to be a recipient of this prestigious award. Well, we're talking about financing. I have to tell you that I worked for 20 years as a grant writer, raising money for my tribe. And it was a very difficult job. And so working in colonial Virginia, where tribes weren't even really recognized, much less someone was going to give them money. Now, they all had nonprofits, but no foundation was going to give them money for anything. And so I created and was trained on many different alternative ways of getting money. When we started to buy land back, we were recognized by U.S. Congress in 2018 based on our 1677 treaty that we had with England prior to the establishment of the United States government. And so when we started to look at land that was being desecrated, sacred land, lands that were historic villages for our tribe, we started looking at federal government. And so we got some federal funding, but it wasn't enough. It was coming out of Washington because we were a federal tribe, but nothing in the state wanted to fund us. We weren't even eligible for state funds. We had to go to the General Assembly and get a tweak in the law to make us eligible to receive state funds. And so then we started looking at philanthropy, and I started going to philanthropic conferences and making connections with people and telling my story, because people outside of Virginia didn't really understand the level of colonialism that we were dealing with. So when I would go to these conferences, they would all be all of these lily white NGOs that didn't know anything about tribes. But when I started telling the story of the cliffs and how it had been desecrated, they wanted to do something to help. And that was really my doorway that was opened to get us in to the philanthropic community. Now I sit in 4 different boards that are related to philanthropic work all over the world, and it's a much better space to be in than I was before. Let me just say that. But we have been able to garner both public and private funding, put them together in a package that enabled us to buy the first phase for $4 million. There were, NGOs that we were working with, but I think it was, I can't remember the lady's name this morning that talked about, we don't want to be used by an NGO for their campaign to raise money. So that's something that we had to deal with as well in going into that space. But then we learned better after that experience, and out of the blue came this $4 million donor, which nobody in the state of Virginia ever dreamed we would even be able to get the money to buy this place back. And so they patronized me when I'd go and talk to them about the money, and they'd promise me, a couple $1 million, and then they would renege on it. And so these people showed up out of the blue with $4 million check. And the Secretary of Interior came to our celebration, all of the people out of Washington, and then Richmond just showed up, uninvited. all of the dignitaries that I had been talking to get money from, and they were just like laughing at me behind the scenes, knowing that I would never get this money, they all came to my party. So it kind of opened up that colonial view of the tribes. And right after that, I started working with all of the other tribes in Virginia that are federally recognized to create this Indigenous Conservation Council of the Chesapeake Bay, where the board is the chiefs of all of the 7 federally recognized tribes there. And we are doing work together to raise money. We have an executive director, and we are hiring a finance person, but to just stand that organization up so that these tribes can get their land back and learn and build capacity to negotiate conservation easements, how to go about getting funding, how to package that funding for acquisition. So it's been quite a journey for me, but we have raised nearly $9 million for these 2 acquisitions, and we have just a little bit left on both of them. So they will happen. One will happen hopefully by the end of this year, and the other one will happen next year. And we'll have about 2,200 acres of our ancestral lands returned to the tribe. I didn't advance it.
Did you want to advance it?
No. It's good.
Seguliako, I greet you and I thank you in my traditional language as a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. My name is Brian Van Stippen. I am the program director for the National Indian Carbon Coalition. We are a tribally led not-for-profit organization working with tribal nations in the continental United States, Alaska Native villages and corporations, Native Hawaiian organizations, and now trying to branch out to engage with First Nations in Canada, which is one of the reasons why I am here today. First off, it is great to be here and to hear all of the stories I have heard this morning from the Indigenous-led panels, especially from many of the tribal and Indigenous leaders such as Chief Ann, whom we are actually engaging with currently through our organization and with her group, the ICC. But it's been very empowering, very, very great and wonderful stories that I've been hearing from some of the tribal leaders and Indigenous leaders I hear and see in the room right now. Again, I am not a tribal leader, so my job is to assist and be there and provide data and information for tribal and Indigenous leaders so that their job is easier and they can make decisions that are beneficial for their communities and for their lands. Our organization, National Indian Carbon Coalition, we focus mainly on development of carbon sequestration projects on tribal and Indigenous lands. We want to ensure that we're protecting and preserving these tribal natural resources rather than extracting or exploiting these tribal natural resources. For so long, some of the easiest ways to derive revenue, was to cut down a tree, to dig up the minerals within our land bases, to allow pipelines to go through our lands, let railroads go through our lands. That was things that were the easiest way to make a buck. Unfortunately, we never even had the rights to negotiate any of those contracts, any of those agreements. That was done by the federal government on our behalf because we were considered to be incompetent. So usually we got the short end of the stick on a lot of those deals. Those contracts were not beneficial for our land bases, were not beneficial for our governments, for our peoples, and for our communities. So with these emerging markets, with these carbon-based markets, while they are not for everybody, which we agree with, they are controversial, they can be useful for tribal lands, for Indigenous lands. We have to figure out how they can work for our peoples. We did not design them. We were not asked when they were created whether they would be useful for our peoples and for our land bases. However, it's my belief that if we can effectively figure out how to create projects on our land bases, protecting and preserving these natural resources, we can truly create beneficial projects that can support our communities. So some of the things that we do at the National Indian Carbon Coalition is design and develop the data and information to present to tribal leaders, staff, and membership. We want to ensure that we have all of the stakeholders within that tribal community, that Indigenous community, to understand what these projects truly entail for the land base. So we work with chief and staff. We provide all of the data, all of the information. We say, here's what you need to know to make an informed decision. Then what we do is that we have that staff go to leadership and say, okay, staff, you've understood what this means for your community, for your people, for your lands. Now it's your job to talk to your leadership and explain to why this is a good idea for your community. We're not here to make any sort of decisions. We're not here to make any recommendations. We're here to provide you that information and explain to your leadership and to your membership why you think this is important for your land base. And then talk to your leadership and get them to get the buy-in. And then leadership finally says, you know what, we do think this is a good idea. We think we could make this a beneficial, show true stewardship of our land bases, show true economic development and diversification on our lands to create revenue streams for our communities. So we have a couple projects that we have designed throughout Indian country and North America, specifically in the United States. A couple of projects I just want to highlight. The first one being with the Mississippi Band of Choctaw, just outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi. And one of the reasons the tribe there wanted to do this project was because they were going to design a K-12 school system. The Bureau of Indian Affairs back in the 50s, 60s created this school. It was run down, dilapidated. They weren't going to update it. The tribe itself said, we want to create this new school system for our students, for our community. How are we going to fund this? They decided they were going to do it on carbon revenue. So on 26,000 acres, we designed a carbon project. We worked with the tribe over 3 years to create this project that would effectively benefit their landscape, work within their community, work with their, again, staff, leadership, and membership to ensure that everybody was on the same page. And then now we are actively selling carbon credits on their behalf because the tribe then went out and in order to get the debt obligation to fund the school, they based it upon what we gave for projections of carbon revenue coming in. That project came online in April of this year. Within the last 4 or 5 months, we have sold approximately $3 to $4 million worth of carbon revenue for that tribe to fund the school system. So we've been actively selling those credits on behalf of the tribe to bring these revenue streams in for that tribal community so they can build this K-12 school system that is now all STEM-based, that has all of the laboratories, has the auditoriums, has the football and athletic fields that the tribes truly wanted for their communities. We're very happy to be able to tell that story. We're out there talking and working with a lot of these organizations that are excited to support this type of activity they see within these communities. And we're starting to show that these can be beneficial for these tribal nations, for these tribal land bases, if we can design these projects correctly. The second project that we wanted to highlight was with the Keweenaw Bay Indian community in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Again, a 16,000 acre project, worked with the community for over 3 years, wanting to ensure that we could show truly beneficial land-based protection, sustainability management practices, how we were going to create these projects, ensuring all of the stakeholders understood what it meant for their lands. The big thing for them was that they are now working with other organizations that have land ownership within the exterior boundaries of the reservation to reacquire some of those land bases. One of the big entities on there is Lime Timber that owns a lot of their forested lands. Lime Timber is working now with the tribe to transition some of those forested-based lands over to the tribe through different land acquisition measurements being funded through carbon revenue. The other really cool thing to me is that they were able to bring on a sustainability specialist. So they brought on internally within the tribe, a tribal staff person to look at all the different types of climate sustainability efforts that the tribe wants to explore, from carbon to renewable energy to whatever other type of opportunity that the tribe really is interested in doing. So now they actually have a climate scientist, a climate sustainability specialist internally working for the tribe, utilized from this carbon revenue stream that they're bringing in. And then the last project that we wanted to highlight is with the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa in northern Minnesota. This is what we have found to be, we believe, in Indian country in the United States, the largest return of land through private acquisition that we have found in our analysis of 26,000 acres to the tribe. Well, we partnered with the Conservation Fund. The Conservation Fund acquired this land from Potlatch, a large commercial logging operator. It was within the exterior boundaries of the reservation for the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa. In order to fund this acquisition and return of the land, they went to my parent organization, the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. We had to find a financing mechanism in order to do this land transfer. So the tribe itself borrowed the funding through my parent organization on full faith and credit. So no collateral, no tie back to the gaming fund, no tie back to the land. And then we had to figure out, how do we pay back this debt obligation? And in order to do so, we designed a carbon project on top of that 26,000 acres to pay back that debt over the next 10 years. Right now, we are in the design phase. Our early financial projections are showing not only are we able to pay back that debt obligation to acquire that 26,000 acres, but at the end of 10 years, the tribe will then make additional revenue in which they should be able to acquire more lands within the exterior boundaries of the reservation, utilizing this carbon revenue. So the tribe is currently exploring other parcels that they want to target. And as we are targeting those additional lands, we can then look at that land and see how much carbon could potentially be generated on those parcels as well, which we then could include into this current carbon project. So we believe that we have designed a model utilizing carbon finance for not only land acquisition, but other community activities that tribes are interested in doing, whatever they may be. Again, this may not be for every tribal community because these are controversial. There are hurdles that have to be overcome, but some of the work that we have been doing and the organizations and tribal nations that we have partnered with have found this as an opportunity. We have now 5 projects underneath our portfolio at the National Indian Carbon Coalition. We are expanding and expecting to have 4 to 5 more here before the end of the calendar year. A lot of work is going on in the Pacific Northwest. We are picking up some Alaska Native villages and corporations. Again, there's a United States Forest Service notice of funding opportunity that was just due on September 30th, which we partnered with Chief Ann and the Indigenous Conservation Council, a consortium of 7 different tribes in the Chesapeake Bay area. It would be the first of its kind in the United States, a consortium of tribes to do this together. We're extremely excited on our end. I think the U.S. Forest Service is excited. We're pretty excited to get this opportunity funded, and the work that could be done on that project, we think could be a model for other tribal consortiums, other tribal nations that want to see this type of work done. And if you were at her last session, seeing some of the lands that she was showing pictures of, it's a new and unique idea that has never been done on tribal lands before that we have seen in the United States that we might be able to, we believe, replicate with other tribal landowners. Again, not only in the United States, but also in Canada. So that's our short story. I appreciate you taking the time today to hear the work that we are doing at the National Indian Carbon Coalition. We're staffing up, we're adding more capacity on our end, we're partnering with other organizations, as you will hear from the rest of the panelists up here. We work with other large NGOs out there to do this type of work. So again, appreciate your time. Yako, I thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rain Playfair. I am the Director of Stewardship Funding for Coast Funds, which is a bit of a complicated organization. It goes through, has a few different labels. Conservation Finance Institution, PFP. Some of you may have heard that term this morning in the Catalytic Conservation Finance discussion over in one of the other rooms. So that's project finance for permanence, which is another complicated topic that I will dive into very slightly here, but I'm happy to chat about again afterwards with anybody who wants to know more. And we're also an Indigenous-led conservation institution. So a couple of labels there. And this all takes place, I'll try to orient you spatially with a map here. Effectively, Coast Funds serves 27 First Nations along the coast of what is now commonly known as British Columbia in what is commonly known as Canada. And it was established as a solution to the lack of financing for conservation projects, particularly Indigenous-led conservation projects within this country. So I'm going to take you back in time a little bit here. Let's go back to the 80s, early 90s, when there was a lot of recognition along the coast, particularly from First Nations, around the fact that deforestation was becoming a major issue. The British Columbian economy was really resource extractive heavy, and the coastal ecosystems that were globally unique, those temperate coastal rainforests, were being really damaged. About 2/3 of those temperate coastal rainforests were either fully logged or partially logged. And the reality was that the trajectory was like, it was on track for being completely gone within sort of a 10-year time period. And that was all happening at the same time as none of those benefits were being shared back with any of the First Nations along the coast. And First Nations leaders were really seeing their communities facing a lot of hardships. There was low employment rates, a lack of access to resources, no economic benefits being shared, and there was no real path forward. So it was really clear that there was a need for a new approach. In 2000, the leaders from the First Nations communities came together to discuss this and to try to come up with a bit of a solution. And luckily at that point, the NGO community was bringing global interest into the deforestation issues. And so everybody sort of came together and realized that there was a bit of a shared goal, and that was restoring and implementing Indigenous-led land resource and water management, and also a goal to restore the benefits to their communities and the community well-being. So discussions and support from NGO funders and the Crown governments occurred, and that sort of led to this brainchild idea of adopting the PFP model, so the Project Finance for Permanence model, as an approach to build finance and to build out a conservation economy. Sorry, these slides are really word heavy, but there is a takeaway for you to later refresh your memory. So in 2006, there was a number of years of negotiations that went on, and in 2006, First Nations worked with both the Crown governments, the provincial government of BC, as well as the Canadian government, alongside the private funders, to develop out what is now known as the Great Bear Rainforest Agreements. And this was sort of a two-part deal. So there was a set of conservation outcomes that were expected to come through the agreements, and part of that was that 3.1 million hectares of forests were going to be protected in conservancies. And then there was also a secondary portion to this, and that was to develop out the organization now known as Coast Funds, which was the finance solution for the maintenance and management of those protected areas. So within all of that, the 3.1 million hectare number is pretty impressive, but then there was actually more land that was then being sort of set aside for ensured management under a framework called ecosystem-based management, which recognizes humans as part of the ecosystems, and that was all with the intention for that to be Indigenous stewardship. The financing piece also is a little bit complicated. There was sort of two methods of financing. There was an endowment that was set aside for the ongoing operations of First Nations stewardship departments and governments. And then there was also a capital piece set aside as a sort of a spend down fund, which was intended to be invested into each First Nations community economic development projects from a sustainable perspective, with the intent that any sort of revenue from those would then sort of circle back through the communities and be able to be supporting, again, vibrant communities and those sort of sustainable resource management activities and basic community well-being. I have a, oh, sorry. Indigenous leadership is a big part of that. And what I want to say is that Coast Funds is an Indigenous organization. Some people would say Indigenous-led. Because First Nations were really at the table, they were driving the discussions for this whole project and for the whole organization itself, Coast Funds does consider it as Indigenous, just Indigenous, straight Indigenous organization. And First Nations leadership happens at all aspects of that organization. I will say I personally am not Indigenous. We have a number of busy Indigenous crew that were not able to come today, so you're stuck with me. But I do have the great honor of working with all the nations that I serve. And I'm hoping that I'm doing them justice in telling this story. So yeah, all aspects of the organization are Indigenous-led. Our governance, we have membership that has representation from the nations that we serve along the coast. Our board is majority Indigenous. They sort of oversee the strategic direction of the organization. All of our funds are invested with a lens from Indigenous and environmental and social goals. And in addition to that, First Nations that we serve take the lead in obviously how they manage and steward their lands and resources, but also which projects they want to prioritize, how they want to see the funds spent, and how the organization continues to evolve. And then I've got a really tiny bullet at the end here about First Nations securing new funding to sort of complete the picture of an integrated model of resource management. The original 2006 agreement was specifically terrestrial based. In June of this year, in 2024, we managed to secure some new funding that was to sort of complete that model and to integrate the marine portion of operations. So looking at protection and management from that sort of more holistic lens. I've thrown this slide up here because I really want to say that I think the numbers speak for themselves. This slide is 15 years worth of numbers that are pretty impressive, and I think have really been a driving tool for the First Nations to secure the funding that I just spoke about in June, because they were able to say that there was over $418 million invested in coastal communities because of this project. There was over 1,300 jobs that were created because of this project, and for the Indigenous coastal workforce, that's actually 13%, which is pretty impressive. So it goes to show that if you're willing to invest with Indigenous direction, that the results will happen. There will be results. I think that's maybe where I'm going to stay, because I think I'm rambling now. But happy to answer any questions, and yeah, just really appreciate everybody listening. Thank you.
It's this one. Oh, but what about this one? Do you want to talk about that one?
I can talk about that one.
I love it. Yeah, this one's good.
Sorry, everybody. Basically, a part of our mandate is knowledge sharing, and our website has some really wonderful stories of the communities that are driving all of these projects, and happy to have people ask questions about it. If you want to go to our website, there's lots of information available there, including policies. All of our policies are really transparent, and a lot of our sort of founding documents are on there, and people can take a look and ask questions as they need to. Thanks.
Yeah, that Finance for Forests, a guide to conservation finance, basically my favorite document to read from Coast Funds. So I'll plug that for sure. Thank you. And Chi-miigwech, Chief Ann Richards and Brian and Rain and Annalisa, thanks for wrangling all of us together. I really appreciate all of you offering what I think are Indigenous conservation finance innovations. This panel is not about financing Indigenous conservation. It is how Indigenous people are actually leading in the space of conservation finance. And all three of these examples are just that. And I'm really humbled to be here today in this co-learning space to share a two-eyed seeing lens on how Indigenous shareholdership in regenerative, durable, and resilient economies is shaping innovation in the field of conservation finance. But before I really begin my remarks, I think it's wise to honor our ancestors and the spirits of the 7th generation by greeting you all in my grandfather's language. Kim Neil, Nindijnikaz, Pelche, Nindodim, Nindojaba, Anishinaabe, Métis, Nipissing First Nation, Ninda, Menado Missing, Odawa, Minis. My name is Kim Neil. On my mother's side, I am a Pelche with Anishinaabe and Métis ancestors from the Nipissing First Nation. On my father's side, I'm a settler. And as a result, you know what? I walk in this world with white privilege. And I walk into this world with white privilege that my mother's father did not have because of the color of his skin and his accent. I'm also the Vice President of Resilient Habitats at WWF Canada, where I have the privilege and responsibility of shaping the protection and stewardship goals of our bold 10-year plan to regenerate Canada. I'm also an environmental engineer that has spent most of my career in capital markets, alternative risk transfer, and ecological economics, underwriting some of Canada's first restoration and environmental impact bonds. And it is my work in this area where I see the most opportunity for Indigenous worldviews to transform our financial systems that are draining Mother Earth's natural capital and accelerating climate change. So it's pretty safe to say that my positionality in relation to this panel of incredible Indigenous-led organizations and on financing Indigenous conservation is intersectional. And it's woven with complexity of all the things that I am. So to simplify, perhaps it's best to begin our two-eyed seeing journey together with a tangible example based in place, and more specifically, my favorite place on Earth, Manitoulin Island. My home is Manado Missing, or Odawa Minis. You may know it as the largest freshwater island in the world. It is a place where we have lakes within Great Lakes. Before colonization and capitalism or railways or highways, before this thing called conservation finance or carbon markets ever existed, this right here was in the middle of the Great Lakes, and it made Spirit Island the epicenter of the Indigenous-led Turtle Island regenerative bioeconomy. But what does that conservation economy on Manitoulin look like today? This map tells a story, and it tells a two-eyed seeing story that I'm going to try and do it justice. The areas in fuchsia are public and private protected areas. The area in orange is Wikwamakwang First Nation. I'm going to focus on them, but some of the areas in green are other reserves. This is one of the only places in Canada where half of the population is First Nations. There's about 13,000 people that live on Manado Minis. Overall, if you add up the public, private, and First Nations protected areas, close to 25% of Manitoulin Island is protected, contributing to our collective 30 by 30 global goals. As an outsider, one might think that this volume of protection means that our conservation economy on Manitoulin Island is doing well. And by all means, it is. But if we look a little bit closer and we begin to understand how each of these protected areas is contributing to our local economy using indicators like jobs, operating costs, revenue, and natural capital, a different two-eyed seeing story begins to emerge. And since I have time constraints today, I'll focus just on one story: direct jobs. The direct jobs created within the dotted area. Within the boundaries of Manitoulin Island, in these areas in particular, the orange and fuchsia ones, 102 jobs are created. 2 direct jobs are created within the public and private areas. 2. Over 100 direct jobs are created within Wikwamakwang First Nation. You heard that right. Wek'uwema'quan First Nation maintains stable annual revenues from their sustainable forestry and non-timber related resources, regenerative agriculture, geomatics expertise that they take all over Northern Ontario, and bioculturally based ecotourism, including these birch bark earrings that I'm wearing today, to directly support 100 local jobs. I think it's reasonable to pause here for just a moment of reflection. This is not about pinning one against each other. This is about two-eyed seeing. It is about looking at both of these indicators, these very Western science direct job indicators, and saying who is contributing to innovation in conservation finance more. Maps tell stories, and this story about direct jobs is a story about Indigenous innovation. It is a story about opportunity, community well-being, and a celebration of culture. The private and public protected lands can't compete with Wek'uwema'quan when it comes to local community buy-in for this conservation solution. So what is Wek'uwema'quan's secret sauce? That's probably what y'all want to know, isn't it? I'll tell you. Indigenous shareholdership. I know this is a new term, and it's going to maybe blow your mind, but this is going to be awesome. Indigenous shareholdership is different than ownership or co-management. And as my good friend Trish Nash said today in her panel, it's about co-governance. It is something that permeates in every inch of the community. Evidence of Indigenous shareholdership, the Indigenous shareholdership concept is also represented within our treaties here in Canada. Nobody ever said that we agreed to privately own lands here in Canada. We agreed to share. This concept is explored further in this report that, the authors are incredible people. I've met them before, Nikia Flores and Lauren Sorrentino. And it was recently released, actually. It's about Indigenous shareholdership in environmental markets. And while I can't dissect the abundance of knowledge that isn't shared in this important work today, I just can't help but highlight that this work is also building on the Canadian-based Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, and gives an applause to the Canadian government for their slow but steady progress in making UNDRIP and Bill 6 C-15 a reality. But I don't want to get off track. The key point I wanted to make about this report in relation to this panel is the two-eyed seeing approach to defining financial systems or economy. Showing these two definitions here on this slide, is not the innovation. The innovation lies in allowing both of these worldviews to exist with equity when we are designing conservation finance solutions. These need to be the basis. Indigenous shareholdership needs to be the basis. I don't care if you're into carbon markets or bio, I really don't care. If this isn't there, it's not going to happen. So, you know what? I got to also come back to my positionality as working for the panda. The panda. I'm an Indigenous person working for one of the largest NGOs in this country. And, it's not super easy, not gonna lie, but it's also really, really great to learn from our Indigenous partners. So really, I need to sit here and be accountable. How is WWF supporting Indigenous shareholdership? And I need to come to work every day and think about that. And well, you know what? We do this in many ways. But the example I will share with you today is the reason I joined the organization in May of this year. In 2022 at COP16, I was in the audience. I wasn't working for WWF, but when they announced this Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area Support Fund, with the vision of supporting emerging and early stage Indigenous-led protection initiatives. My initial impressions about this fund was that WWF Canada had actually listened to the countless Indigenous leaders, including myself, who had been advocating for the need for philanthropy to fund early-stage Indigenous-led protected area initiatives. Most public and private and philanthropic funding sources, and I think Chief and Richard, you really outlined this, they require these Indigenous-led conservation initiatives to have several staff or a fully cooked forest management plan or carbon maps or a 3 to 5 year work plan or budgets, or to be incorporated as a land trust. This is just not feasible for some of these early stage IPCAs. There's over 100 IPCAs that have been declared here in Canada, enough to meet and exceed our 30 by 30. But they are just not getting the funding. WWF Canada believes that success lies in the process of relationship and trust building. This is why this year WWF Canada has distributed $500,000 to our inaugural group of 7 early-stage Indigenous-led protected initiatives. But you won't see these incredible initiatives plastered all over our marketing materials or our social media posts. Why? Well, because we've already learned some lessons. That's, why I'm here today, to tell the lessons that we've learned. Supporting self-determination and shifting power in conservation finance means that funders, particularly philanthropic funders, can't be at the center of the conversation anymore. Respecting communities on their journeys to define what an IPCA looks like to them and what it means to them, we need to take a back seat. Decolonizing 50 plus years of philanthropic funding practices won't happen overnight. From the expressions of interest stage to the selection, our team, with the guidance of an Indigenous advisory for this fund, made significant efforts to make this process different, but still, we felt trapped by the same old applications, interviews, and competitive process that inevitably sort of comes out of these granting funding programs. So, that leads me to my second and my last key lesson learned here, and that's Indigenous shareholdership. Having this Indigenous advisory for our first round of funding, was super helpful. And in our case, they were exceptional Indigenous leaders who have all contributed to foundational work like the We Will Rise Together report and the Indigenous Circle of Experts. These are all individuals who have helped bring IPCAs to prominence in Canada. And I personally will be forever thankful for their guidance and wisdom as our team issued our first round of IPCA support funding grants. But that said, they did not want to make any of the decisions on who would receive funding. The applications were all just too good, and they constantly challenged us to take the leadership role on rethinking how we did that funding. Well, guess what? Challenge accepted. This is why, moving forwards, WWF Canada will be offering all our inaugural IPCA Support Fund recipients a seat at the decision-making table to shape the future of this fund. This is how we will continue to work towards Indigenous shareholdership in our philanthropic funding model, and asking all of our inaugural recipients to pay these gifts forward in reciprocity, but also working with them. Will this new approach be messy? Yes, it's already a bit messy, for me anyway. And then, but will these inaugural fund recipients want to join the decision-making table? All of them, we also know probably not. But this fund will change year over year, and it better change because it needs to. This is what innovation looks like. It's always a dash of uncertainty, a dash of creativity, and a dash of two-eyed seeing. And I hope it works, because this is my favorite fund. Anyways. But we look forward to continuing to share the lessons learned from this IPCA support fund. It's we are one of the first organizations that came out to do this. And, you know, we need to share those lessons in spaces like this, even though like I don't even have a fully cooked idea about this shareholdership idea, but it needs to be workshopped in places like this. And so as this financing for Indigenous conservation evolves, we hope that you are just as excited as we are about the possibilities that Indigenous shareholdership presents to the environmental markets, but also to philanthropic funding models that also need to change. So Chimigwech, to all of you for listening attentively and really excited to continue engaging throughout the rest of this conference.
That was amazing. We're off here. I'll do on here. I feel so energized just sitting beside you now. And very excited to observe how you're going to continue your decolonization necessarily of funding models, this funding model moving forward. I wanted to give our panel, actually, do you have any questions for each other before we move? Like anything you'd like to follow up on that you're thinking about?
Turned it off. We had Kim go last because she's the spark plug, you know, get everybody re-energized on all of this stuff. But when Chief Ann was talking and Kim mentioned this a couple of times, you know, with this philanthropic dollars out there, and a couple of us were just at Climate Week in New York, what we see in Indian country with Indigenous lands is that 1/2% of all of philanthropic dollars goes back into these Indigenous organizations and communities. There's just not enough funding going back into Indigenous-based organizations. That's a frustration. That's why your Chief Ann is out there after all of her time, 20, 30 years of this work, doing the grind, has had to get onto these organizations to go out there and advocate for other Indigenous-based organizations to get funded. And it's over and over and over and over again, because again, 1/2% of all philanthropic dollars goes into Indigenous-based organizations. It's just not enough out there right now that's supporting the type of work that we need to get done on our land bases in Indian country and on Indigenous organizations. So I just wanted to throw that statistic out there because we're talking about data, we're talking about lands. This is information that people need to know.
Brian, let me just make a comment to that. So we are seeing a turn in the tide. So I have been doing this advocacy both at the federal level and in the philanthropic community. And we are seeing a lot of the larger foundations actually have Indigenous programs. Now they're looking to us to help, and they recognize kind of like the colonization model that they've used all of this time. And I don't know if it's peer pressure or what goes on within these organizations, or maybe just an epiphany that they have been in this space and they now know better and want to do something different. So it is changing. It's a slow change, but it is changing. So I just wanted to add that.
And I'm curious, I'd just like to ask Rain a question. We were speaking earlier today. We speak a lot at NCC about endowment, and you'd indicated that Coast Funds utilizes an endowment model, which typically has been used by universities. We build it into some of our processes as well. But I'm just wondering if you could expand on the potential there for funders, if they would find it successful, how it benefits Indigenous communities directly, please.
Yeah, thanks for asking. The endowment model is really interesting, and particularly, I think the lessons learned within Coast Funds is that it's been really successful for First Nations communities. Within the development of the organization and the setup of that endowment, there was obviously a number of sort of purposes for which those funds could be used. But at the end of the day, the nations themselves are in charge of how they want to use those funds. And Coast Funds as an organization has a fiduciary responsibility to those funds. So we have to make sure that that's within those sort of set upon purposes. But we don't get involved beyond that, basically. And I think that's allowed a lot of growth and innovation from the nations that we serve. And it also allows them to do a lot of planning, because you can't plan for work if you don't have funding for it. And the endowment model allows for annual returns that they can count on every year. It's sustainable, they know it's coming, and that in many cases allows them to keep a staff. And that's, if you don't have funds every year, if you're constantly scrabbling, if you're coming from a place of scarcity, there's no way that you can have the capacity to take on the projects that you're wanting to take on. So I think that I'm hoping that answered your question, but that's my perspective of how it's been successful, yeah.
That's great, yeah, and if anyone would like to follow up on that as well, I really find that interesting. And Chief Ann, I'm curious about it, when all of the land that you were speaking about is returned in 2025, another thing I certainly focus on through my role is, moving to that next step of what we call stewardship. And most importantly, that reconnection to the land base. And I'm just curious about your next steps after 2025 when the land is back within your tribe. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that we have developed is our plan for all of that up front before we ever really went in to try to get any of this land back to protect it. So part of that is going to be because of the colonization being so heavy in Virginia. A lot of our history was hidden and not brought out publicly. Or it's been changed for the conqueror's perspective. And so part of that is going to be bringing that history out, truth. And I think that it was Richard this morning that said, he's had all of this work with anthropology and archaeology and history, and we've done the same thing, and going to highlight the history of the tribe in all of these different locations that the tribe had towns that no one knows anything about, as well as we've done a partnership with U.S. Fish and Wildlife in a building that was, they didn't want to manage anymore because it was dilapidating and they didn't want to invest the money in it anymore. So they gave it to us. And so we have raised the money and we're renovating that. And that's going to be our Indigenous Conservation Education Center. So not just us learning and having the knowledge of Indigenous conservation, but being able to teach it to children who are going to be our senators and our governors and our decision makers in our country, so that they understand the importance of this. So that's the other part that we want to do there. We want to bring in tourism that is going to be good for the land and healthy for the people, and then the utilization of our river, restoring our Rappahannock oysters, restoring our herring, and the medicines that we gathered there. So it's really a holistic kind of approach to restoring these things that have been, we've been deprived of all these years.
That's really amazing. Brian, we have excited and brilliant carbon accelerator team in NCC, and they're definitely interested in learning from you, and we've talked about how you can be hopefully working with us and communities in Canada more. So we're curious about the best structure of carbon transactions you found. Of course, where I'm from, in just south of Calgary, there's a lot of grassland. We're recognizing how imperiled that ecosystem is. I'm curious about, the carbon transactions, or what has worked best for Indigenous partners that you've worked with so far to maximize value for the community. But also, have you worked in the grassland environment at all? Yeah, so it's kind of two-pronged. I'm curious about both.
So our goal, as I had mentioned, is to ensure that the tribal and Indigenous leaders are the ones making all of the decisions. So you guys are the ones running the show. We are there to assist in providing the information. My background, I'm an attorney by trade. I've worked my entire career in Indian country. My job was to be behind the scenes to provide all of the information so Chief Ann was making the best decisions that she could for her community and for her lands. That's what I want to make sure that my job continues to be. So here's the data, here's the information. You make the decision what you think is best for your community. That's what we want to ensure. We believe that we can design and guide that path so that these projects can be successful in the future. As I mentioned earlier, we have 5 right now. I feel strongly that we are showing that we can create high quality, high integrity carbon projects that on the market itself are showing others globally that indigenous-based projects can drive this entire marketplace as to how these projects can be designed correctly and appropriately so that the entire market can succeed as a whole, again, being driven by indigenous-based projects. But those are mainly focused on forest-based lands. Not all tribes, not all indigenous communities have forest-based lands. So, as you asked, we are looking at other types of natural resource bases that tribes have possession of. One of the tribes that we currently have a project with that I did not mention is with the Blackfeet Nation in Montana. As part of that relationship, looking at a forest-based project, we are now exploring a grassland-based project as well. They have their brother tribes across the border in Canada with the Blackfoot Confederacy. We've been talking with them in preliminary conversations as well of saying, how might we be able to collaborate across border with doing one big aggregated project with all of the parties to look at these opportunities to work together. Because in my opinion, I mean, I don't care what the feds say on either side of the border. This is our lands originally. We didn't have a border that separated us. That's created by some other entity, not by the indigenous peoples or the tribes. So we're going to work together and figure out how we can make this work. Whether it be on a forest-based projects or a grassland-based projects. We also have currently row crop projects. We have grazing and pasture land projects. There's a lot of bison restoration going on in Indian country and in North America, in the United States. Right now, my tribe, the Oneida Nation, we just did bison return back to our lands. So if there's a return of bison on grazing lands, you can do that. We are also now exploring peatland sequestration. Peat is a big sequester, wetland and reforestation opportunities along that. Stream bed rematriation is another one. And then one of the cool ones that I was just asked about the other day from a tribe in the Pacific Northwest was seagrasses and kelp. So can we do blue carbon? And as long as you have the rights over those types of natural resources, we can figure out a way of how to enroll that into a carbon project. Again, this stuff is not always for every single tribal landowner. There is controversy. It does take time, but that's our role at the National Indian Carbon Coalition, is that tribally led, not-for-profit organization, is that we hope we can come in and assist in that educational process with all of the stakeholders, leadership, management, staff, to show that these can be beneficial for the land bases, that these could be actually successful projects to help derive additional revenue streams and not have to extract or exploit those natural resources over time.
That's amazing. It's so exciting. I'm trying to think for Kim. You just have so much experience. And the fact that we have drawn, so many amazing people from across the globe, so many different countries where everybody's in different space, and you've stepped into, through your organization, and leading that decolonizing funding model. It's really exciting to hear. Do you have any suggestions, recommendations for people who, are liaising with government and funders in terms of how change could continue to be made, in terms of how funding is provided, supported, reported on or not, moving forward? Anything that comes to mind based on your experience?
You know what, I feel like, Brian, what you just said too, kind of triggers me in relation to this. That triggers me in a good way. I've heard this a couple times today, in the catalytic financing panel and just now, as long as you have rights. As long as you have rights. And I would swear normally right now and say, screw that. Indigenous peoples in Canada have the carbon rights. It is colonial constructs that say that they don't have the rights. Like, that's just like, just like money is a colonial construct. Like, if NGOs, if funders, if TD Bank, who I hope is in the room, if RBC, who I know is in the room, can really get their head around this. Like, you don't need to own the land to have the carbon rights. If we can build that, not just here in this room, but like globally, as we begin to create much of the regulatory institutions that are required to manage environmental markets. Because let's just like all take a moment to reflect. Like, we are at the start of an entirely new economic system. We do not need to move forward anymore with those same understandings of what rights actually means in this context. This is why I just like wanted to talk about Indigenous shareholdership, because if we are actually embedding that in how we do these partnerships and put these deals together for carbon, it doesn't really matter if, like this rights thing keeps coming up over and over again. So that's like, it really requires all of us to like get on board with this Indigenous shareholdership game. And that is what's going to unlock, I think, a flood of real capital, because that's what's preventing that private sector capital from coming in. They think, oh, it's risky. I don't know if they have rights or not. No, they have rights. And I think that, the NGO community can play a really, really important role in that advocacy.
That's awesome. Great. Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. So we've caught up some time here. Saved my bios, which was good. So I can come around, and if anyone would like to ask a question, I know how to turn this mic on and don't fall off the stage. It's on. I think it's, there we go. It's good.
I'll try to make this a question. Hi, Darcy Riddell with Restore, Assert, Defend, RAD Network. And so, hi everyone. I guess I first want to just make a comment that kind of connects, which is that I, 25 years ago, sat at the land use planning tables that created and worked on the campaigns that created the Great Bear Rainforest Agreements. One of the parts of that story that wasn't highlighted either in the PFP discussion or in this discussion that I think is really important for us in this room. I'm someone who worked as a campaigner with ENGOs, and the question around how do we create these conditions for collaboration. We were campaigning our asses off. It didn't just happen, and what was on offer by a willing government was essentially 12% protected area, and lo and behold, the area in the Great Bear was already 11% protected. We got 70% protected. And that was because we got contract cancellations from large forest companies and basically brought them and government into a completely transformed conversation with First Nations to talk about rights and title and a radical conservation agenda. And that's what we all need to keep doing, is pushing those envelopes, not just accepting what's handed to us as the art of the possible right now by governments, by institutional funders and financiers. So I hear threads of all of that in what you're all saying. And so if we're looking at financing mechanisms, of course we're trying to de-risk, but we actually need to be de-risking for Indigenous rights violations. We need to be de-risking for biodiversity and climate crisis. That needs to be our first, second, third commitment, and then de-risk for the financial institutionalized spaces. So it's more of a call to action, really. But I think that the power building piece keeps getting overlooked when we're comfortable bringing, oh, everyone just sits around the table and magically some transformational outcome happens. That's not what happens. It's uncomfortable. Everyone in this room has to be willing to have courage to take risks, to piss people off, and to push. And together, if we link climate rights and biodiversity conservation together, we can actually make the leaps forward that we all know we need Otherwise, we're overshooting so badly. So I guess I'm curious in terms of that mechanism of like, how have you seen the power get reframed so that something much more transformational is able to happen? And Rad Network is working on that, you know, to link together Indigenous, nature, finance solutions that embed rights and responsibilities from the get-go as we build that ecosystem in Canada. But if you can talk about power and how you're seeing, like, how do you create appetite for bigger change? I think that's worth hearing from you about. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's great.
Not me. I'm just joking.
Okay, I'll do my best. Thank you, Darcy, for pointing that part out. It is a huge part of the story. Yeah. It didn't just happen overnight. And I think we've just gone through sort of the marine PFP process, which happened more quickly, absolutely, because power had already been built. There was sort of basically 18 years worth of people coming together, of agreeing on shared goals, of campaigning, of pulling and pushing levers where they could, and also a great amount of luck in terms of timing for how, which governments were in power, which were coming in, which were coming out, all of those sorts of things, and global pressure as well driven by the NGOs in Canada that then sort of filtered out globally to help push that all forward. Back to the question at hand, which is power. And I don't know if I have a satisfactory answer for how do you build power, but I do think, again, I'm really humbled to work for Coast Funds because I have witnessed every day the power of the nations that drive it. The results they're achieving, all of the, how they view conservation as more than just terrestrial or marine-based. It's about cultural reclamation. It's about reconciliation. It's about projects that are impacting, the ability for people to come back to their homelands, which they haven't been in. And that in itself is a source of power, right? So if we can be supporting that type of ground-based conservation, that builds power in people, which people sometimes like the word empower. I think that people are inherently powerful. We just need to get out of the way to allow that to flourish. Anyone want to add to that?
Thank you. I will talk about this a little bit because I pissed people off a lot. And I've become known as the woman who gets shit done. So I'm only an hour and a half from DC, and I spend a good bit of time there with this administration, but this administration has been so much easier to work with than previous administrations. They really do care about the environment. And I think that's been one of the things that has been so pivotal to the movement that is taking place in Indigenous countries because, because of the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, in the United States, wants these tribes she's been there in government all this time. She's seen all of this money just flowing through, billions and billions of dollars for conservation. Tribes are nowhere to be found in any of it. And I think that she made that a priority in her administration. And because of that, the different agencies have a different look at the way things are being done now versus the business as usual as it was before. I must tell you, I work with lobbying groups all the time. And some really powerful lobbying groups are in conservation. And I'm on this conversation with them because I've gone to the White House and rattled the cage and said, hey, this money is coming from our natural resources, but we're not eligible for it. What the hell? And they're going, oh, wait, we can do something about this. I get a call from the lobbying group saying, we need to talk to you. We need to talk to you, Chief Ann. We don't want you to rattle the cages up there about this fund because this fund is a mandatory every year appropriation. And we're afraid if you go there and open this up, it'll change something. So if there's a little wrinkle, and these were the very words that he used, this is an attorney now, I mean years on the Hill. If there's a little wrinkle that exists, then we can give that to a tribe. And I didn't curse him, because I've learned not to do that when I worked on the Hill, but I wanted to so bad. And I said, well, excuse me, but we're a bit more than a wrinkle in this country. These are our natural resources that you're deriving revenue from that are going to everybody else in the country except for the tribes. So tell me where the equity is in that this administration is known for. And he says, I have to get off the phone right now. And I said, okay, bye. But you know, it's those kinds of mindsets for the lobbyists that are running around the government lobbying for this money for their cause. They don't see anything beyond their cause. And when you challenge that, they're like, wait, what's this lady up in Washington doing messing with my money, right? And so it's important to educate the lobbyist. Some of them can be educated, some of them are willfully ignorant because they don't want things to change. But either way, it takes education with the lobbyists because they're very powerful. But you can extract some of that power from them by challenging them in the old way that they've always done things.
And just to follow up on what Chief Ann is stating, you know, under the Inflation Reduction Act, there was billions of dollars put in addressing climate change. And yes, there is funding that is going to tribes, but it's a trickle. And one of the trickles of what was the funding source that the Indigenous Conservation Council just applied for was a $20 million set aside for tribal nations, Alaska Native villages and corporations, and indigenous groups of $20 million for the 574 federally recognized tribes to apply for. 20 million that we all have to then scrap for between us to get with a $2 million ceiling. Like, that's great. You know, we'll do it because that's what we have to do, whatever. But we're out here battling amongst ourselves to do these wrinkles, trickle down that finally ends up in our pockets that we have to battle for. And then we're talking to the U.S. Forest Service or USDA, and we're saying, well, yeah, but we did a set aside for you guys. Isn't that nice of us? Again, these are our natural resources. This is what we're doing. You know, this is our lands. This is how we do this stuff. And I just wanted to mention, you know, terminology is important for how we speak in Indian country. And when I got not yelled at, but we started to try to use the word empower, and I dislike that word as well because we don't need to be empowered by anybody. We have the power as Indigenous peoples. We've always had the power. We need to utilize the power. So we don't need to be empowered by a federal government. We don't need to be empowered by a state government. We don't need to be empowered by an NGO. We have that power inherently. We need to be using that power. So we just have to be careful when we start using those words, when we start talking to outside groups. And it gets difficult at times because I've done it myself, speaking to large groups. It gets frustrating and I get mad at myself, but you know, it's awesome to be able out here to tell our stories, to be at panels like this and to hear individuals like Chief Ann, and I get to hear Jimmy's story this morning from his organization and his group, and to see the video that he's showing about some of the same issues that we have with my peoples in Green Bay, Wisconsin, to see what he's having in Northern Canada with diabetes and health issues and food sovereignty and protection of our lands. I mean, no matter where we are as Indigenous peoples, we're having many of the same concerns and issues that we have to deal with on a day-by-day basis. So I appreciate your time.
I've had some time to reflect on your question, Darcy. Thank goodness for these prompts here, by the way. The financial system, and you know, you've heard me talk about this, and actually normally when I do panels like this, I talk about ecosystem services. And I talk about this beyond carbon perspective. And you're right now on balance sheets across the globe, nature has essentially a value of 0, absolute 0. And this is why, like, at WWF, like, the conservation finance portfolio is certainly under the portfolio that I manage, and we are completely focused. And like, I started this work, Darcy, before you knew I moved to WWF, about writing new financial accounting standards here in Canada that actually incorporate nature on the balance sheet. And, some of the problem with this right now, by the way, for natural capital, natural asset accounting here in Canada, is a lot of the pilots and case studies have been done in a mostly colonial lens. This is why I have designed, as you know, 5 of the first Indigenous-led natural capital asset valuations. And what really needs to be done when we're really rethinking ecosystem services. And I heard today, like, oh, cultural ecosystem services, that's a hard one. Yeah, it actually is the hardest one. Do you know why? Because it has rights and reconciliation embedded in it. Overall, they did a recent study, and this is one that I'm digesting still, of the ecosystem services valuations that have been done globally. Cultural ecosystem services actually leads. It's the one that's valued the most, but it's only narrowly valued for recreation and tourism. Indigenous peoples know that is not cool. And they, like, in the natural asset valuations that we're doing, where we're actually centering cultural ecosystem services and then the rest will follow, I think it's really going to demonstrate like a new way of thinking. And so before we actually write these new accounting standards, and this is why I'm involved in like the public sector accounting board, new accounting standards, as well as the private sector, is that like we need to bring these pilots there, and we need to sort of when we get nature on the balance sheet, we must get rights and reconciliation on the balance sheet. It cannot be separate. It has to happen that way. And that is what is going to transform our financial system. And I think it will shift power significantly. So I'm really glad that I had time to like ferment that question. Thank you.
I'm going to add something to that. Oh,
Yeah.
Don't know if that's the perfect note to end off on, and I'm so glad that we were able briefly to speak. I know it flew by, to talk about ecosystem services a little bit. And I'm really grateful to everybody for being here today, most especially to you four. I appreciated our rapport right from the beginning, and I knew this was going to be very, very special. So thank you so much for your time. Very grateful for your knowledge and expertise, and look forward to continuing to learn from you and connect as we continue on in our journey. So it's coffee break again, I believe, with the next session, our final session, starting at 4 o'clock. Before the evening's festivities as well, and honoring someone who's so deserving tonight. We can't wait. So thanks very much. I'd like to give our group a round of applause, and thank you very much. Okay.